Brad Oneil, thank you so much for joining me on the Calgary Fitness Podcast. I've been really excited for this one for a couple of reasons, because we've been going back and forth talking about, the epidemic. I want to use that word because I think it's important. First off, tell people what you do and who are the people that you help.
Okay, so I guess the type of work that I do is kind of twofold. So I'm an addictions counselor, have been for 14-ish years, 12 or 14 years. I work in a private practice, so I see my specialty is in substance abuse and compulsive sexual behaviors. And so I see about 25 clients a week in my private practice. But some time ago, I guess about 2 years ago, I started to get interested in curious about why we're not utilizing technology to the extent that we could by making quality programming available on the internet for people to get help with addictions. So to that end, I started a new company called Global Addiction Recovery, and I've taken all the protocols and programs that I use with my one-on-one clients and that I used to use in my group rooms and put them onto a platform in an online learning environment because of the growth of online learning. I think I mentioned to you earlier, Justin, that stats show that, and it was a study done by Forbes magazine back in 2015, that less than 4% of people in the United States actually get help for treatment with substance abuse. So part of that is because of the expense of it. The average cost of treatment in the US is $14,000 for a treatment program. And that's probably on the low end. So there's some lower cost programs, but 5-star treatment facilities are probably charging upwards of $50,000-$60,000 US for a 60-day program, a 6-week to 60-day program. So that's out of the reach of people, the average person in any event. So I wanted to make some programming available to people that can't afford $14,000 or $60,000 a course, that can go online. Some people are perfectly capable of doing self-directed work, and not everybody has to go to a treatment center or into AA. So there's lots of different ways that people get sober, so it's sensitive to that. And
Sure.
Of course, with everything that we're hearing about the opioid epidemic, that's a big concern as well. There's people that can't get access to services, or won't get access to services in some cases. There's lots of help out there when people reach out, but sometimes it's a matter of not knowing where to go. There's a variety of different agencies. Working on a project right now to try to pull some of these agencies under one umbrella, so somebody has kind of a one-stop shop to find out where they can get help for homelessness or addictions or mental health issues, that type of thing. So.
Yeah. And that's a real barrier to entry, the cost. The cost when people think, if they're struggling and suffering with some sort of addiction, to say, okay, here's your final price tag. I mean, that's got to be devastating.
It's huge. It's huge when they make a commitment to get in somewhere, and any of the treatment facilities that are government run or foundation funded that are cheaper for people who can't afford it usually have quite long waiting lists or inavailability of beds as a result of oversupply of people needing help. So they make the decision to try to get in somewhere, and then there's long waits to get into some of the facilities as well. But the biggest, for quality treatment, I think the biggest barrier is the cost of it for people.
So where are you directing then, I guess, how are you going to help people, or how are you hoping to help people then?
Well, by using the internet, my hope is to use a business to consumer model, to have people access to my website, which has been operational now for, I'm going to guess we rebranded, but I'm going to guess the rebranded website has been operational for about 6 months, 6 to 8 months. We use traditional means to get our word out, search engine optimization, some AdWords, those types of things. And we have people buying our courses from the UK, from the United States, from Australia, from Jamaica, so quite a bit of reach. So there's some appetite for online help for sure.
And so it's not 14,000.
Oh gosh, no. Our substance abuse program is $160, an 8-week long program with over 100 pages of exercises that they complete, and lots of resources on our website as well. And that's just one of the 5 or 6 different programs that we offer. So we also do a program for relapse prevention. We have a program on there for sexual compulsivity. And we're trying to introduce these programs into the corporate world as well, because there's a huge problem in corporations with an average of 9.4% of the people that work at any company struggling with substance abuse of some type. And they need help in allowing people to put their hand up without being judged, without the stigma of admitting that they have a substance abuse problem, and take some online programming anonymously and get some help that way. So we're working with some corporations right now too to introduce some of that stuff into the corporate world.
So talk a little bit about, I'm just going to move the camera here, but talk a little bit about the stigma itself. I think that's quite interesting too, because when you talk about people who are, they may not even know that they're addicted. Is that fair to say?
Oh, sure, lots of people. Sometimes despite all the evidence mounting around them, such as relationship breakdowns, job losses, and things like that, they're unwilling to see that it's the correlation between the drug or alcohol use that's causing the problems for them. Mm-hmm. So sometimes it's an education process. So part of what we walk them through in our courses is to get an understanding that there is a problem. Most people don't come in some people come in with a real strong idea that I have an addiction issue and I need to deal with it. A lot of people are pushed into the door of a treatment facility. That was the case when I ran my intensive outpatient treatment program. A corporation or a partner, a spouse or partner says you have a problem, and if you don't do something about it, you're going to lose your job or lose your relationship. So they come in reluctantly, so we spend a lot of time educating them on what it looks like and how their behavior is indicating that they're leaning towards a substance use disorder.
And I'm going to assume that education plays the highest role, or one of the highest roles when it comes to getting someone help or recovery?
Well, it should. I don't think there's enough out there that educates people right now. So, lots of times even when people come to see me one-on-one, it's because somebody that they know has suggested that they get help, or the relationship's going to be over, or they're going to lose their job. So they're trying to protect something that they have. They're clinging to a world that they know, and sometimes unable to admit that there is an issue. So it's an education process to get them to the point where they're seeing their behaviors are moving them along a continuum from mild to medium to excessive substance use, and they're getting into trouble as a result of that.
Sure. You may not have the data on this or anything like that. I kind of thrown you a curveball here, but I'm curious, Calgary specific. I mean, we're seeing a lot of economic issues right now and job losses, and the downtown vacancy rate is quite high. I'm just curious, in your practice here in Calgary, do you notice a spike right now?
I think the spike started some time ago. I think, and again, you make a good point. I don't have any stats. It's just kind of based on my sense, my finger on the pulse beat of what's going on with my own clients and things like that. But yes, I think so. Like, there's a lot of fear right now because of the economy. I've had people come in from the oil and gas industry that are still employed, but don't know for how much longer, and they're using substance use as a way to cope with the fears that are going on in the marketplace. It used to be that it was a badge of honor in Calgary to say I'm in the oil and gas industry, and I've had several people that have sought my help recently that are saying things like, I don't tell people I work in oil and gas. I have a friend who's an accountant with an oil and gas firm that says I just tell them that I'm an accountant. I don't say anything about oil and gas anymore because there's that percentage of the population that's really anti-oil and gas industry right now. So that causes its own type of stress as well. So, and fear of jobs, and people often turn to substances to cope when there's other mechanisms out there that could help them. That's part of the education process. What are the choices, right? Doesn't always have to be drugs or alcohol. Interesting.
Wow, that's incredible. And we were talking a little bit off camera too. Talk about the workforce itself. You could be sitting there in your office, and maybe you don't use substances, but what are the numbers for people who use the substances in the workforce?
Okay, so a rough breakdown, and this is based on a study done at the University of Chicago in conjunction with the National Health Institute in the US. They determined that 9.4% of any workforce is struggling with a substance use disorder. Now that varies and can go as high as 15% in some industries, so some industry categories are a lot higher. So, I'm a bit of a stats nerd, so I believe that can be applied against any corporation or any cross-section of any population with a reasonable degree of accuracy. The other interesting statistic about this, and this is the one that was a real eye-opener for me, is that 76% of illicit drug users are in the workforce. So our general perception is that those are the people that are homeless, living behind a dumpster or in a shelter or something like that, but 76% of them are actually in the workforce. So people can be working beside somebody and they may know or may not know, but sometimes it's a pretty well kept secret depending on corporate culture as well.
Yeah, and I'm glad that we brought you on the Calgary Fitness Podcast, because we were talking a little bit about before too about how the behaviors themselves, how the underlying behaviors when it comes to addiction can apply to can apply to other situations as well. So maybe talk a little bit about the underlying behaviors that could lead someone to abuse some substances.
Sure. Justin, you mentioned before the stigma around addiction or substance use disorder, as we're calling it nowadays. And there is still a lot of stigma, a lot of people that believe that why don't you just stop drinking, or why don't you just stop using? But the realization is that nobody wakes up one day, myself included, and I'll self-disclose, I'm a recovering alcoholic addict. People don't wake up one day and choose this for themselves. And that was one of the big things for me when I first got into the program, as I heard of some of the old timers were always saying, well, you drink because you're an alcoholic. And I started to think about that, and I thought, that's kind of the dumbest thing that I've ever heard. Something got me here. I didn't wake up one day when I was about 14 or 15 and think, oh, I think I'd like to be an alcoholic for the rest of my life. So I had to start looking at it. About a year of sobriety, I started to go, wonder what got me into this mess. And I started looking back into what I perceived to be a real healthy family of origin, to discover that it wasn't as perfect as I thought it was. And just about everybody, I always say I'm looking for the unicorn, but just about everybody comes in, some of them in denial, like I was in early recovery, thinking that I grew up in a Norman Rockwell painting. And they come in thinking that their upbringing was really good, and then as the stories go on and the trust builds and things like that, we find out that there was abuse and neglect and all kinds of dysfunction happening in the family that started the ball rolling towards substance abuse. And it may be, sometimes it's alcoholic or addicted parents, sometimes it's physical, sexual, or emotional abuse that goes on in either at home or with in school groups, coaches. There's all kinds of places that it can happen. And so those are some of the underlying issues that drive addiction. And that's one of the questions that we need to start asking, is more about what happened to you. So arrest the primary addiction, that's really important. But once we kind of get some traction on that, I'm always looking for what got you here in the first place. Not why are you this way, but what happened that put you in front of me seeking help, or on my program seeking help, on my online programs. And so I have a program on my online, as well as one that I deliver one-on-one, which is about dealing with underlying issues that I call living authentically. And it's looking at family dysfunction and other contributing factors to the disease of substance abuse, or sexual compulsivity, my two areas of expertise.
Wow. And I'm curious too, we were talking a little bit about, I think the line you said was that anytime that you use a toxin to escape something, that is abusing a substance. Is that fair to say?
Well, not necessarily, but it's I guess it's a red flag for me. So lots of times people will come in, they're under stress because of work situations, home situations. They're maybe recognizing that their drinking or using patterns have changed. It's starting to get to be a little bit more. And so what I always tell them is, when we're using substances to cope with things, rather than exploring all the other methods first, it can be a slippery slope for a lot of people. Right? It just kind of escalates because, if you take a couple of drinks to take the edge off when you get home from work, and pretty soon that's not working, and then it's 3 or 4, and that leads to, going to the bar on the weekends and whatnot. There's there can be a real problem starting to build there. And that's where it starts for a lot of people. It's just, I need to take the edge off because of something I'm feeling inside that I don't have any other mechanisms to cope with.
Of course. And I think that's fair to say too, is that it is a slope. It's not you have one and you're an addict. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, absolutely. We always talk about addiction being a progressive disease. So, the average person that ends up in my office or in treatment or online starts out doing what they see done in their family of origin or with their peer groups. They're drinking while they're in college, or they're weekend warriors, and it just escalates because it becomes something that they go to rather than saying, maybe I should see a therapist, or maybe I should start, working out, exercising to relieve my stress, or going for walks, or any one of the number of other healthy behaviors to deal with the stress rather than just using substances. So it just gets to be a snowballing effect, and then there's a tipping point. There's a tipping point where it's gone from casual drinking to something way beyond casual and social and into problematic drinking. Then all of a sudden there's major life areas are starting to get impacted by the behaviors, and the substances interfering with work and productivity and ability to communicate and connect with people on an emotional level. And they end up in trouble as a result of it. We always say continuing to use the substance despite the harmful consequences. But because it gives the relief that they're needing, they're reluctant to look at the harmful consequences because it's helping them escape from the reality of what's going on for them.
Well, I want to thank you for being so open and candid and saying that, you went through a similar situation too in your past. I'm curious, as someone who's now helping other people, how does empathy and to other people's situations, how does that play into it?
Oh, it's a huge role. I often joke that I have a doctorate in alcoholism. I have a couple of undergraduate degrees in other substances and behaviors. So I think it qualifies me eminently to be able to show empathy and compassion for the person sitting across the table from me. I've been in their shoes. I've walked in their shoes. I don't, share all of their life experiences, but I know the prison that addiction can be. I was locked in that prison for a lot of years. Like, I've been sober now for 16, but I drank fairly consistently for 33 of those, and I drank, I consumed a terrible amount of alcohol in my final days before getting into recovery. So I understand what's going on with people better than their families do, because I've walked a mile in their shoes, if you will. So
yeah. And did that kind of blend your passion to help other people then?
Oh, absolutely. And that happens for a lot of people when they first get into recovery and they start to feel better and they start to see the number of people around that are needing help. Lots of people who are addiction specialists and therapists that deal with addictions of all kinds have a history themselves of it. Not all of them, but some of the people that I know might not like me saying this, but I think the ones that do are a little bit better qualified. They've got the education background, and plus they have the personal experience of knowing what it's like to be in that spot, to lose jobs as a result of it, to lose families as a result of it, and that type of thing. So, we always talk about those of us that have addictions think a little bit differently than most people. Most people can't understand, that's the stigma part. It's like, why would you harm your family?
Yeah, of course.
It's not a choice.
Yeah.
Right? It gets to a point where it just becomes not a choice.
Okay. And I think the word used perfectly is jail. You're locked in a prison.
It's absolutely a prison. So.
Yeah. So if someone's listening or watching right now and they're, how do they identify or recognize that somebody may have an addiction, whether it's, maybe they're addicted to your specialties of alcohol or the sexual side of things, or whether it's maybe somebody's looking at steroids, or maybe somebody's looking at food addictions, those kinds of things. How do you recognize?
Sometimes it's difficult because the families, the loved ones, the co-workers have trouble recognizing the signs, because I always say to people, the addiction has to survive at all costs. So the addict gets very adept at protecting that, learning how to lie and manipulate and be deceitful. So it's hard to pick up on some of the signs, especially in the early going. The kind of the typical markers that you look for are obsession, compulsion, and inability to stop, regardless of the harmful consequences. So lots of times somebody has to be pretty advanced before somebody who knows them that may not be an alcoholic or addict themselves really recognizes that there's a problem here, because they use in isolation or drink in isolation, or they find ways to be deceitful about the amounts that they're consuming. They keep hidden bank accounts so that they have availability of money to buy their drugs or the alcohol without family members knowing. So it can be pretty difficult. Usually on some level, families know, partners know that there's something that's off, can't quite put a finger on it, then they start being hyper vigilant, looking for all the signs and researching and things like that. But again, there is help out there. There's support groups for families. We have a program for family and friends on our website as well, for people to learn how to recognize the signs, questionnaires to help them identify whether somebody that they know might be kind of going over that edge and starting to have some significant impacts in their major life areas.
Yeah. Well, and one of the big television shows that was, on the networks years ago, remember that show Intervention?
I do.
Yeah, so what are your thoughts about that for family members versus, I guess, how could they approach helping a loved one?
Well, that's a great question, Justin, because I do interventions as well. I don't do many of them, but I have done several of them. Lots of times families at wit's end will get in touch with somebody like me or a licensed interventionist and say, I think we need to do an intervention on mom or dad or son or daughter, that type of thing. And I always caution them against that. That's a last resort type of thing. One gentleman that I did an intervention on described it perfectly. He said it's an ambush, right? So we brought family in all together, followed the rules, followed the book as to how this was supposed to go. And he said, there's no other way to describe it. Like, you're starting with an intervention, you're starting in a hole. You're trying to get somebody to face up to something that they're not ready to face up to themselves, or they would have taken steps themselves. So you're forcing them into situations where they don't want to be. Alcoholics and addicts are typically very defensive, again, because they're trying to protect the disease. So it's a hard hole to get out of. Lots of times with interventions, people are whisked away to treatment facilities and things like that. It doesn't guarantee that they're, they haven't gone out there for the right reasons. It's not because they want to be there. I wasn't intervened on. I was, in a manner of speaking. I was kicked out of my house. Turns out it saved my life. But the bottom line, I wasn't very happy about it. I wasn't willing to admit that I had a problem at that point in time. So you can imagine the same type of situation where it's, we're going to spirit you away to a treatment center. You're jumping in a cab or jumping on an airplane going somewhere with no notice and all paid for already. You're going to come in with a really bad attitude. In my situation, I was a relapser for the first year I was in the AA program, and that was because I was doing it to save my marriage, to save my family, that type of thing, rather than to save me. So when you're starting with an intervention, the person has to be then educated that this is about saving themselves, but it becomes about, I guess I have to do this because the family's pushing me out the door. Right?
Yeah. So then how could a spouse or a son, daughter, whomever, approach that, I guess, gently? Like, is it more, let's do this together, or how would you approach that?
Well, it's going to be met with opposition. So again, circle back around to the disease has to survive at all costs. So it kind of takes on a life of its own. So if I have a partner that phones me and says I have a partner that's struggling with some addiction issues, and often it's the partner or some family member that makes the first call, probably in about half the cases. Usually what I say to them is, why don't you just have them come in and have a chat with me? Because I'm not the enemy. I'm like them. I can understand what they're going through. I've been through it myself. Whereas they are in a situation where it's like, well, you're trying to get me to change. There's nothing wrong. I promise I'll quit. Those types of things. So I always suggest to them, just have them come in for a chat with somebody that's been through this. Sit down and find out if you see yourself in some of his stories, and make your own decisions from there. I usually find that's the best approach. There's no magic to any of this. Sometimes that doesn't work either, because sometimes people just are still not able to cope with the reality, face the shame of the stigma that goes along with saying, my name's Brad and I'm an alcoholic.
Yeah, Absolutely. And I'm assuming there's a lot of defensiveness when it comes in this too. Like walls go up.
Absolutely.
Yeah. How hard is it to break down those walls?
Really hard. But again, depends on the individual. Some people are ready. They're just, I hate to use an old trite expression, but they're sick and tired of being sick and tired. And they're just done. That was my case when I finally made up my mind. But most people come into recovery hoping that they will learn how to drink or use normally again. And the chances are that, again, I'm looking for the unicorn. I haven't seen that happen in my practice. I'm not saying that it's never happened, but the chances of that are pretty slim. But people come in kind of hanging on to that. We have a culture that centers around having a glass of wine with a meal, or going for a beer with the buddies after work, or all kinds of sporting events, beer league, hockey teams, curling, you name it. It's very prevalent in our society, and so they feel that their life will be over. And I remember that too when I came to the realization that I'm never going to be able to drink again. I thought, who will I be able to hang around with, right? What will I be able to do? In fact, I remember thinking, well, what will I drink? It was, because that was all that I was drinking at the end.
Sure.
And I just didn't realize there were a million other beverages out there that I could choose from. So,
talk about the idea that I'm really curious about alcoholism specifically, because while I can't pinpoint who is an alcoholic, the thought to me that when I hear the line that I drink on all social occasions, it's 5 o'clock somewhere, I hear that a lot with some people that I love in my family, right? And it's hard for me to identify what they're doing when I'm gone, right? Because I find that even when it's, a Wednesday night and it's, hey, do you want a glass of wine with dinner? I'm gonna have another glass. And I'm just, how do you know when the social side of it becomes a little bit dangerous?
Well, you use a good example. Somebody that's like, maybe you're a one glass of wine person with dinner, and somebody's always trying to pull you into their drinking pattern. It's like, oh, come on, have another one. Because that gives them permission to continue drinking. Also, people who are always looking for events where alcohol is served. Lots of people who are, fairly advanced or heading down the spectrum towards extreme alcohol abuse don't like going to places where there isn't alcohol served, right? So frequency of it is a big thing. The amount that they're consuming is another big thing. What type of events they're going to, who they're hanging out with. An example of that is, I thought everybody drank because I grew up in a family that drank. And as a consequence, my family didn't really hang around. I had a couple of family members that didn't drink, my mother's sister, and we didn't hang around with them because alcohol wasn't served well. When my parents would invite people over, the alcohol always came out. It seemed quite social at the time, but then you start to realize when you sober up yourself and look back on the patterns, they didn't invite people over that didn't drink, or drink by and large, or didn't at least allow them the permission to drink in front of them. So it's kind of looking for those things. We also have an expression that if it walks like a duck and talks like a duck, it's probably a duck, right? Yeah. So there's, in advanced stages is all kinds of things like, sneaking out to have a drink, or noticing an extra beer can when you thought they only had one, or finding stashes of alcohol in places that you think, well, that's weird. I don't remember that bottle being there, or that can of beer being there. So lots of signs that you kind of pick up on along the way.
Sure. And I'm curious too, talk a little bit about social circles themselves. For example, like we can relate this back to, fitness and whatever type of addiction, but people who use steroids, they may hang out with a certain crowd of people, right? People who are alcoholics may hang out with more alcoholics. I guess, how can you identify if your social circle is doing you harm?
Yeah, can you clarify the question for me, Justin?
So yeah, I'm just curious, like, if the people you surround yourself with make a difference when it comes to escaping addiction.
Well, I think so, because if you're hanging around with people who are escaping themselves rather than drinking socially, it just kind of leads to that. Just like we were talking about, the friend that when you're trying to get up to leave, it always is kind of pulling you back into your seat and say, oh, come on, have one more. Or don't worry about it, I'll drive you home if you've had too much to drink, or you can always take an Uber when you go there with the intention to just have one. And I think there's a lot of pressure to kind of stay and have another. And, we see that happen a lot in college crowds where it becomes a drinking culture and an over drinking culture. And a lot of that is about peer pressure, and it happens outside the college circles as well, where if you have one beer and leave, you might be looked down upon if you work in a culture there where the crew gets together and goes for a few beer after work, right? Which happens frequently, and it's lots of times it's more than one and you're still under the legal limit. It's 3 or 4 beer and everybody's getting in their vehicles going home, and you get pulled into those environments sometimes where you might not be a drinker, and then you're cajoled into have another one, or let's do a shot before we go, those types of things, right?
I think that was the main point that I was hoping to get at, is that peer pressure and just people being sucked into it when maybe they don't want to, at the end of the day.
That's a possibility. And of course it's easy to say, you have to stand up for yourself and respect your boundaries and do something like that. Easier said than done in some of those circumstances.
Especially if it's like a family member or your best friend from grade school, or you know what I mean?
And it often is. It's often someone like that you trust, and you're hanging out with people that are friends that are in your social circle. So there is a lot of peer pressure to have the other one, and it's really hard for people to say no to that, particularly when our culture normalizes it, right?
Yeah, and I think the biggest takeaway from this entire thing for me was that you're not doing this for anybody else. You're doing it for you. You're doing it to survive.
Yeah, absolutely. If you're doing it for people outside of here, so let me give you an example. Let's say I'm doing it for my wife, and she's outside of she's in my external locus, what I call my external locus of validation, and so I'm doing it to keep her. And then all of a sudden she says I'm leaving. What have I got left, right? What if my kids walk away from me and I don't have any reason to stop drinking then? What if I'm doing it so I keep my job? And all of a sudden there's a downturn in the economy, and I walk in one day and I'm laid off and I'm escorted out the door, and the only reason that I was trying to stop drinking was to keep my employment, and that's taken away from me, not because of my drinking, but because of a downturn in the economy. Why stop drinking if that was my reason for stopping drinking? I might as well just start again. So a relapse might happen in a case like that. And if people can't readjust and say, oh, I was doing it for other reasons too. I was doing it for my health and for a bunch of other things. But at the end of the day, we have to do it for ourselves. And we often say that the road to recovery is a pretty solitary journey sometimes, because there has to be laser focus on protecting your recovery at all costs, and not falling back into peer pressure and all the temptations that there are in society nowadays. You can't turn on the TV without seeing drinking or ads for liquor stores. You can't walk down the Stephen Avenue in the summer without there being patio bars set up everywhere. So take away anything outside of yourself that you're stopping for. If it disappears, why stop?
Yeah, right. And it's okay to be selfish. I don't know if selfish is the right word, but it's okay to say that I deserve this.
Yeah, to say I need to stay focused. One of the first things that I teach people is that your recovery has to be the number one thing in your life. You work your life in and around your recovery, not your recovery in and around your life, because pretty soon you're slipping off to go to places that you shouldn't be going. You're hanging out with people that are always saying, come on, Justin, have a beer with me, right? It's Friday, you're done working now. It's a beautiful summer day, and we're barbecuing in the backyard. And, if you've been a drinker in the past, people are trying to push that beer into your hand, and lots of people will make fun of you. Like, I know when I stopped drinking, I shared that with one of my brothers who was struggling himself, and he said, sounds like a personal problem to me. I don't want to hear about it. And he was right. It was a personal problem, but he didn't want to have anything to do with it.
That's incredible. I think that's really eye-opening for me personally, because, there's not a lot of times where I have people in my life where they're addicted to something, but if you pull back a little bit and realize that any situation that may be normal to me, like walking down Stephen Avenue and seeing the bars open, can be very triggering. to someone who's suffering from addiction?
Yeah, absolutely. And addiction comes in many forms too. Like we're focused in on drug and alcohol abuse, but there's sexual compulsivity. There's all kinds of addictions that people get into. There's gambling addictions, and when you add up substance abuse, alcoholism, drug addiction, sexual compulsivity, and gambling, you're close to 25% of the population that's struggling with those 4 diseases. So if you imagine yourself again in a room with 4 people, statistically speaking, you've got a good chance that you're standing near somebody who's struggling with an addiction problem. So you may not recognize it. You don't recognize the gambling addict as being a gambling addict because they don't have alcohol in their breath or their eyes aren't glazed over, that type of thing, but they're struggling equally as hard. I read another research paper that said that everybody is within 1 degree of separation touched by somebody that has an addiction problem. Right? So that's 3 out of every 4 people that could be touched in some way. There could be a brother, a sister, a mother, a father, an uncle, a close friend. So you don't have to look much outside of about a 6-foot radius to find people in your world that you may not identify as struggling with an addiction problem, but are struggling with an addiction problem.
Wow, that's amazing. Brad.
Some of them can be, one of the biggest ones right now for corporations is addiction to prescription pain medications. So that's part of the opioid crisis that we're going through. People get reliant on those as a result of an injury, whether it's an on-the-job work injury or something like that. But it's a huge percentage of the work population that's struggling with that. And those people miss more days of work than the general workforce, and then with anybody else with any other type of substance abuse issue. So.
Wow, amazing! Really eye-opening, Brad. Thank you so much for being so open, so candid, and sharing your story. I think that's really a lot of value to the audience, because I think that if they can recognize it, then they can perhaps help someone who, or maybe themselves, they may be able to get the help that they would need. Yeah,
and I think a big important message is there is help out there. I will sometimes hear people say, my husband can't find any help. Well, there's all kinds of agencies that will help. So I would challenge the person on that. There's free agencies. There's all kinds of 12-step programs. I know a lot of people don't like them, but there's non-12-step programs. There's all kinds of agencies, government agencies, Alberta Health Services that does addiction services as well. That's included in our Alberta Health Service costs that we don't pay for anyway. So there is help out there. So, put your hand up, identify. You don't have to identify to your closest friends or anything like that. You can go online, you can find help. There's lots of resources out there. So you don't have to go this alone. That's an important message. Sometimes addicts and alcoholics feel alone because they're ashamed to reach out. They're ashamed to say, and I think that's partially because of the stigma, because you have people say, well, just stop, right? Or I've got no use for people like that. Why don't they just make up their mind and quit? And when people hear that, then it makes it that much more difficult to reach out for help. It's like we think it's a moral failing. It was really tough for me to reach out for help, in spite of the insurmountable pile of evidence all around me that my life was completely out of control. For most people to say, I need help, that's one of the most difficult things that they'll ever do. And whether it's addiction or other mental health issues or things like that, there's so much stigma around admitting that I've got a problem and I can't deal with this on my own. Wow. But there is help.
Good. Awesome. Brad, if people wanted to find out more information about you and what you do and who you serve, where can they find more information?
Well, my private practice is called recoverycalgary.com, so they can find me on that website. My online training programs are at globaladdictionrecovery.com. Lots of resources on both of those websites about addiction, substance abuse, sexual compulsivity, different types of drug abuse. There's family and friends programs. There's relapse prevention programs that are on there, all easily accessible from a financial perspective. And I'm always happy to sit down and have a chat with somebody face to face, free of charge, just to find out where they're at and see where I can direct them that best fits their needs.
Brad, thank you so much for doing this. I really
appreciate it. My pleasure, Justin.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much.